אורחים נכבדים ועמיתיי מהאוניברסיטה הפתוחה, בוקר טוב לכולכם וברוכים הבאים. אני שמחה לפתוח את כנס צ'ייס השני למחקרים בטכנולוגיות למידה לשנת 2007, ומברכת על ההזדמנות לארח אתכם כאן בקמפוס היחסית חדש שלנו ברעננה. המחקר בנושא טכנולוגיות הוראה ולמידה צובר תאוצה רבה בשנים האחרונות, וזה בדיוק סוג המחקר שמן הראוי שישפיע תוך זמן קצר יחסית על הטמעה ויישום של הטכנולוגיות האלה כאמצעים פדגוגיים. אנחנו בהחלט רואים את עצמנו כמובילים בתחום הזה, ומודעים לכך שאצלנו וכמובן גם בכל המוסדות הנכבדים שאתם מייצגים, מצטבר גוף ידע עצום וניסיון רב שיש ללמוד ולבחון אותו היטב כדי ליישם את הטכנולוגיות להוראה בתמהיל הראוי ובאופן המושכל ביותר. והכנס הזה הוא באמת במה לדיון ובחינת הנושאים החשובים האלה, ואני מקווה שהוא באמת יהיה מוצלח. כמה מילים על מרכז המחקר על שם צ'ייס. אצלנו באוניברסיטה הפתוחה, כמו בכל אוניברסיטה, מתקיימת פעילות מחקרית תוססת. חברי הסגל של האוניברסיטה הפתוחה עוסקים כל אחד בתחום המחקר שלו, וביחד יש אצלנו ייצוג מגוון מאוד של ענפי המחקר השונים. אבל לפני מספר שנים הוחלט על הקמת מרכזי מחקר אינטרדיסציפלינריים שיאגדו בתוכם חוקרים מתחומי דעת שונים. מרכז המחקר לשילוב טכנולוגיות בהוראה על שם צ'ייס הוא למעשה מרכז המחקר האינטרדיסציפלינרי הראשון שהוקם באוניברסיטה הפתוחה, והוא מהווה מסגרת לשיתוף פעולה בין חוקרים מתחומי דעת שונים הן באוניברסיטה הפתוחה והן מחוצה לה. זאת השנה השנייה בה יוזם מרכז צ'ייס את הכנס בנושא האדם הלומד בעידן הטכנולוגי, ואני מקווה שאנחנו מייסדים כאן מסורת שתימשך עוד שנים רבות. A few words in English in honor of our distinguished guest, Professor Terry Anderson from Athabasca University. Professor Anderson, I'm honored to welcome you and at our second annual Chase conference on instructional technologies research. I thank you for sharing with us your vast knowledge and experience in a series of lectures, including the keynote lecture in this conference, and I wish you and all the other participants an enjoyable and stimulating meeting. אני מאחלת לכולכם כנס מוצלח, מהנה ומפרה, ומקווה לראות אתכם אצלנו גם בשנה הבאה.
תודה לפרופסור סורוז'ון. אני מזמין את פרופסור יורם אשת, ראש מרכז המחקר על שם צ'ייס, לשאת את דבריו. יורם.
שלום כולם. אני מאוד שמח לראות את האנשים שהגיעו לכאן כבר לכנס השני, ואני מקווה באמת שאנחנו צוברים כאן תאוצה שבסופו של תהליך נגיע לגובה שיעוט, והכנסים האלה יתנהלו ללא מאמץ עם קבוצה מאוד גדולה, קהילה שפועלת ועוסקת בתחום. בראשית דבריי אני רוצה קצת להחזיר את אלה שעוסקים בתחום הזה קצת איזה 10 שנים אחורה, משום שלפני כעשור פעלו בעולם הרבה חברות שעסקו בפיתוח של סביבות למידה ייעודיות בתחומי הלמידה, חינוך, סביבות עתירות טכנולוגיה, ועם צמיחת האינטרנט, וזכורות לטוב, לוגל, דיונטיקס, לחלק מאיתנו היה כבוד לעבוד בהן, ועם השנים, עם צמיחת האינטרנט, החברות האלה נעלמו מהעולם, אני חושב לצערנו, מבחינות רבות, ואנחנו נותרנו עוסקים עם טכנולוגיות שפותחו לא למטרות חינוכיות לימודיות בלבד, אלא טכנולוגיות תקשורת, טכנולוגיות לארגון מידע, לניהול ידע, אבל לא במטרות למידה ספציפיות, לא למטרות חינוכיות, אף אחד לא פיתח את הטלפון הסלולרי או את מחשבי כף היד לצורכי למידה, וקנה לו את המשחקים ואת הצ'אטים וקבוצות הדיון. ונותרנו כיוזרים שלא היו שותפים בתהליך הפיתוח. זה תהליך אנומלי, בדרך כלל כשמפתחים מוצרים, היוזר איפשהו שותף בתהליך הפיתוח, ופה אנשי החינוך לא שותפים בעניין. ומה שאנחנו עושים בעצם זה מאמצים טכנולוגיות ועושים להם אדפטציות לצרכים שלנו. בנוסף, הטכנולוגיות מצויות בשינוי הולך ומואץ עם הזמן, ועד שגמרת לזהות את הפוטנציאל הפדגוגי שגלום, או ההוראתי שגלום בטכנולוגיה מסוימת, היא כבר נהייתה אבסולית, ואתה מתחיל להתעסק עם טכנולוגיה חדשה, וכולנו מכירים את הפודקאסטים ואת הוויקי והטכנולוגיות שצצות בעורף שלנו, ומנסים להדביק את הקצב מין רץ מרתון שעוסק כל הזמן בהתחדשות, מה שעושה את התחום הזה מאוד מעניין, פורה ומאתגר. מצד שני הוא מעמיד בפנינו מספר אתגרים קשים. אני אנסה להציג 5 מהם. אני מניח שלכל אחד יש את החמישייה הפותחת שלו. הראשון מביניהם בעיניי הוא הפיתוח של מיומנויות קוגניטיביות וחברתיות רגשיות שמסייעות בשימוש נבון בטכנולוגיות. זה לא פשוט, זה קל להפעיל אינטרווייז, לדעת איך מפעילים את אינטרווייז, אבל קשה מאוד ללמד באופן אפקטיבי בסביבת אינטרווייז, שבה צריך לנהל משאבי קשב בו זמנית בכמה מישורים עם תלמידים, עם התוכן וכו'. אותו דבר לגבי צ'אט או לגבי קבוצות דיון, להתבטא באופן אפקטיבי זה דבר אחד, וטכנית לשלוט במדיום זה דבר אחר. אלה מיומנויות. אני מדבר על שיפור של הבנת הפוטנציאל הגלום בטכנולוגיות חינוכיות. יש טכנולוגיות כמו ספרים חיים, משחקי מחשב, יש להם פוטנציאל לימודי, צריך לדעת לזהות אותו, זה לא כך פשוט ולא טריוויאלי. יש האתגר של שדרוג התיאוריות והאסטרטגיות של למידה. רוב התיאוריות הלמידה פותחו לא בסביבות עתירות טכנולוגיה, יש פה צורך לשדרג ולעדכן את התיאוריות הקיימות לצרכים הקיימים. יש צורך בפיתוח של מודלים הוראתיים שעושים שימוש נבון, מתרגמים את התיאוריות והמודלים למודלים הוראתיים שעושים שימוש נבון בטכנולוגיות. והדבר האחרון שאותי ברמה האישית ועוד כמה מחבריי מאוד מאתגר, זה ההבנה של האימפקט של טכנולוגיות על התנהגות האדם. האם הטכנולוגיות יוצרות חברות מסוג חדש, מנהיגות מסוג חדש, התנהגות אנושית במרחב מסוג חדש, או שבסך הכל אנחנו משכפלים פה את הקיים בעזרת איזה מין אפנדיקס כזה הקרוי טכנולוגיה. אלה הכל שאלות מעניינות. העולם של עוסקי טכנולוגיות הלמידה הוא עולם שמערב רוב העוסקים בו, ואני מציע לכל אחד לחשוב מאיפה הוא הגיע למקום הזה, לא למד את העסק בצורה מסודרת. מעט מאוד אנשים למדו instructional design באוניברסיטה, ואני יכול כרגע לחשוב רק על אדם אחד שאני מכיר שלמד את זה מסודר, בטח לא אני בא מגיאולוגיה. והעיסוק בתחום הזה משווה לתיאוריה טובה, לעקרונות טובים, למודלים חזקים, שיאזנו את התזזיות שמאפיינת אותו. מצד אחד גישות מרשמיות שיוצרות מוצרים טכנוצנטריים, חסרי לב אולי, ומצד שני גישות יוריסטיות גישות טכנוצנטריות שיוצרות מוצרים יבשים יחסית ומאוד יעילים, אפקטיביים, אבל איפשהו חסר בלב. מצד שני מוצרים מאוד יצירתיים, אבל לא ברורה האפקטיביות שלהם. ותיאוריה טובה היא מין עוגן טוב שמחזק את העסק הזה, יוצר סביבת למידה יעילה יותר. הדבר הזה מחייב ביצוע הרבה מחקרים, עבודות יסודיות ויצירה, בראש ובראשונה יצירה של קהילה של עוסקים בתחום, שמעצבים את השפה ואת הסטנדרטים שלהם, נפגשים, מציגים עבודות, וזו בדיוק המטרה של כנס צ'ייס, הפעם כנס צ'ייס השני, אני מקווה שיהיה גם השלישי, הרביעי, החמישי וכו'. אני כבר לא אהיה מן הסתם אז כשיהיו עוד הרבה, כנס ה-40, אבל אני מקווה שזאת מסורת ארוכת שנים. השנה, בתוך מטרה לפתוח את הכנס הזה כלפי חוץ, בנינו אותו בשיתוף פעולה עם עידן, הרשת האירופית ללמידה מרחוק, בעזרה גדולה של גילה קורץ, שמצויה פה איתנו וחברה בוועדת התוכנית של הכנס. במסגרת הזו הוצאנו קול קורא לכל חברי עידן לשתף פעולה עם אנשים שמאמריהם יתקבלו לכנס, כך שאנשים שפה מאמריהם יתקבלו יודעים על מה מדובר, בקרוב אולי תתחילו לקבל הצעות לשיתופי פעולה סביב המחקרים שלכם, כך שאנחנו פותחים את הכנס, מרחיבים אותו כלפי חוץ ככל האפשר. השנה גם, כמו שיואב הזכיר קודם, הרחבנו את הכנס לאפיקים נוספים, כמו מושבי פוסטרים, סימפוזיונים, דיונים וכו', ואני מקווה שמי יודע, השנה הבאה אולי נעשה עוד משהו אחר. ולסיום דבריי, ואני אסלח לי כל מי שאשכח להזכיר את שמו, ממש לא בכוונה, ואני אקריא את זה מהכתב ליתר ביטחון, אני מבקש להודות באמת מכל הלב לכל מי שהשתתפו עמנו בארגון הכנס, לוועדת הארגון, ליואב יאיר, יושב ראש הוועדה, למאיר הפריבמן, אסנת צרפתי, עליזה אלרן, דפנה גרינבוים, אורית מנדלוביץ', תודה למערך משל באופ ובמיוחד לגדי וייסמן וצוותו, למאיר יצחקי ממערך התפעול, ליחידת המחשב, לבני פרידמן ואבירם הדרי, להוצאה לאור, ליונה לשד, רותי לשם, זאביק פרל, שרון איואן, ראום השחור, ליאורה גרינברג ולכל מי שעשה במלאכת עיצוב הספר שאתם מחזיקים בו בפניכם והמודעות והתוכנית של הכנס, לחברי ועדת התוכנית, ראובן אביב, מוטי בן ארי, אבנר כספי, דוד מיודוסר, נאוה פליסקין, גילה קורץ, יעל קאלי, שייזף רפאלי וגם אנוכי הייתי בראש הוועדה הזו. לשופטי המאמרים, כמה עשרות אנשים שברצון רב שפטו את המאמרים ואפשרו לנו לבחור את אלה שנוכל להציג. הייתה פה הגשה הרבה יותר גבוהה ממה שיכולנו להציג ביום שלם, ועל זה אנחנו מתנצלים, דחינו חלק, לא הייתה ברירה, חלק גדול לא הייתה ברירה. ובסיום תודה מיוחדת לחברי ועדת ההיגוי של מרכז צ'ייס, ניצה גרי, יואב כספי ואבנר כספי, המצויים תמיד בלב העשייה במרכז צ'ייס ומסייעים בכל היבט הקשור להובלת הפעילות במרכז. And finally, I wish to welcome our overseas guests who fled the chilly European and American winter in order to enjoy the warm Mediterranean climate. Our keynote, Terry Anderson from Canada, Yishai Moore and Neil Winters, who came from England to present the workshop here, Yair Levy and Michelle Ramin from the USA, who will present their research results here, and Miss Signy Katz, Press Cultural Affairs Officer of the Canadian Embassy in Tel Aviv. I wish you all a pleasant conference. אני מאחל לכולם כנס מוצלח.
בוקר טוב, אני עובר לאנגלית. I'm switching to English. Let me just put your lecture up. זה הלקצ'ר שלו? No. This is it? Okay. It is my privilege and honor to invite Professor Terry Anderson from Athabasca University, which is our Canadian sister, Open University of Canada. Professor Anderson is a professor and the Canada Research Chair in Distance Education at Athabasca. He had published widely in the area of distance education. I think most of you are familiar with his publications. On distance education and educational technology, and has co-authored or edited 5 books and numerous scientific papers. Terry is active in provincial, national, and international distance education associations and a regular presenter at professional conferences. He teaches educational technology courses in Athabasca's Masters and Distance Education program. He has degrees from the University of Alberta, the University of Oregon, and the University of Calgary in Canada. Terry is also a director of CEDAR, the Canadian Institute for Distance Education Research, which you can find at cedar.athabasca.ca, and the editor of the International Review of Research on Distance and Open Learning, IRRODL, which you can find at www.irrodl.org. The complete text of his most recent edited book, which is titled The Theory and Practice of Online Learning. I think this manuscript will be very valuable to many of us. And it is available free as an open access resource at cda.athabasca.cau.ca. And I think Terry will show you the way to get there. So I welcome you, Terry, and welcome here.
Well, thank you very much. It is really a thrill when a Canadian gets an invitation to go someplace other than Canada in the wintertime. So I'm really honored to have been asked to come here. And I've been treated very, very well, especially by our host, Yoram Ishat, and he has confirmed a theory that I've been working on. I learned that his PhD was in geology. And you may wonder why geologists tend to rise up in the ranks of leadership at universities, and I'm beginning to think they're the only ones who really understand the speed of change that happens at universities. This is a little picture of where I come from after a recent snowstorm from space. It looks pretty white, and it is. A quote from Canadian author Jan Martel, who says that Canada, it's a great country, it's much too cold for common sense, inhabited by compassionate and intelligent people with bad haircuts. So that's Canada in a nutshell. This is my university. As was said in the introduction, it's Canada's Open University. We are also the fastest growing university in Canada, about the same size as the Open University of Israel, a range of programs very similar to what you have here. And we've spent a lot of time getting to be regionally accredited, the first university to do so by a U.S. accrediting body. I'm not going to talk about Athabasca. It actually is a real thrill to be asked. I wouldn't have picked the topic of social and cognitive and teaching presence myself, because it seems it's a little bit in my past. I haven't really been actively working in that area. But when Yoram suggested that that would be a topic of interest, I, of course, had to find out what had been happening. And I was quite thrilled to know how many people, including Israelis, who have been referencing that work in the last few years. And so it was really nice for me to have an opportunity to look back. And I guess it might be a little inspiration to show that sometimes we do small projects that turn into larger projects. And then, as in the case of this one, I was very thrilled to see so many people pick it up. One other thing, this is a story that I'm really being treated like an expert here, and there's a saying in Canada that an expert is someone who lives is more than 500 miles away from home, and so I'm really an expert here today. But that I was struggling with how hard that must be for you Israelis to be an expert in Israel. And then I heard this quote from one of your famous prime ministers: "Don't be so humble, you're not that great." And so I think that's enough introduction to myself. I'm going to talk about the evolution of the community of inquiry model, about cognitive presence, social presence, teaching presence, and talk a little bit about people who have been working in that area and have validated and extended our work. Then I'm going to talk about some of the misgivings I have about the content analysis upon which this was based, and hope that we can continue to develop that model, but when we look at the different context in a very network-intensive world that we're growing into. So let me talk to you a little bit about why we got into the community of inquiry model. And from 1998, my colleague Randy Garrison and I were researching quite extensively in this area. And it was because computer-mediated communications threaded discussion list by far then was really the dominant and practically the only way to have a discourse at a distance that was social and collaborative. And it was a revolutionary new tool at the time, because distance education, of course, had always been an individual form of study up until that time, or maybe a little bit of audio conferencing and video conferencing, but there was nothing that allowed freedom of time and of place, but still allowed a group interaction. So it was very intoxicating for distance educators to get into it. And but there was a lot of hype and a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's so reflective, it's so wonderful." And you'd go and you'd read some of the transcripts and say, "I just don't see it here," you know. So we wanted to have some kind of a tool or some kind of a way that we could properly understand what was going on, so that we could provide some guidelines for teachers and practitioners, and so that we could, maybe think of some ways that we could make interventions and we could see whether they made a difference empirically, without just having people brag about how wonderful it is. We wanted to be able to prove it. And we also realized the affordances of computer-mediated communication. It was machine-readable, unlike all of the other discourse previous to that time in all of history. It was time-independent, and people talked a lot about how different it was when you could reflect on your conversation before you said them, so that you weren't afraid of blurting out something that was ridiculous. You had time to think about it and work on it. And we thought that there was a lot of knowledge that could be hidden in those transcripts if we could develop the tools to pull them out. And we really wanted to have it so that teachers could do it, not just researchers, so that they could try something different in their class and they could instantly get the feedback of how it had changed the cognitive presence or the social presence that way. So that's what our motivation was, and we wrote a little anecdote about a teacher who, was all wowed the first time they tried computer conferencing, and they saw how wonderful it was, and they thought, oh man, there's so much higher order thinking going on here, and the best thing is it's all in the transcripts. And so at the end of the class, they read, 1,500 transcripts. Takes them 3 days to read them. After finish reading them, they don't even know what higher order thinking is themselves. And so they hire a couple of grad students to help them, and then they find that one grad student finds 1,200 instances, and the other finds 400 instances, and even the coding, and just a whole morass of problems. And then you get into ethics problems. I don't know if you struggle with that here, but we have to get ethics approval, and is it private, and are you intervening, and do you have to ask permission for everybody who's participated, on and on and on. So it was such a mess that we thought that would be a very good thing if we could do some research to aid people like Professor Jones. So what we really wanted to do, though, was to create a model to have this theory-driven and theory-generative. And we wanted to, what does a good theory or a good model do? It creates order and provides simplicity in describing and understanding complex phenomena. And hopefully from that good model, good theory, we could improve practice through developing guidelines and reflections. And you can be the judge of whether we've succeeded. The methodology we used was quantitative content analysis. And it was important that we were looking for reliable means so that it wasn't just me who could see all these wonderful things, but you could see them and we could count them and we could validate and verify them. And so we were really on a quantitative mindset when we first got into this systematic, reliable examination of the symbols that were left. And we wanted to describe what happened. We wanted to be able to draw inferences. We wanted to infer from the communication about how people are using it. We wanted to be able to quantify people's impressions. And we wanted to be able to do it as I mentioned earlier, in a way that we could compare, replicate results, and increase our understanding. So this was the sort of the seminal article we wrote in 2002, and it was interesting. Now you go into Google Scholar, and almost 200 people have cited this work, so we are validated and very thrilled to have that kind of acceptance for it. And we tried to lay out a conceptual model and then talk about ways to work from it. And this paper, as well as 8 or 9 others that we did, as well as links to papers that other people have done, we've gathered together at the communitiesofInquiry.com site there. And these slides will be posted on the conference website, too. Our leading rights was the American John Dewey. I find that no matter how fast the technology changes, you can always go back to Dewey and find really inspiring things to read. He's a very practical and pragmatic kind of person. But here's his talking about where cognitive presence grew from, in our minds anyways, his writing on reflective thinking, to be active, persistent, and a careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of grounds, and have to validate it and support it for further conclusion to which it tends. We also were inspired by another American, Matthew Lipman, and he was the first guy who really coined the term community of inquiry, and he talked about it being questioning, reasoning, connecting, but in a social environment. And I think for us this was quite revolutionary because, previous to that, as I said earlier, distance education was always an independent study kind of an activity, and now we are sort of making it so it was really a social and communal kind of activity. So this is the big 3 diagram that Randy Garrison always says he's built his career on Venn diagrams, and this is one of his biggest. You've probably seen this one around, but it shows the three: social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. And we were sort of working on those almost in isolation, trying to identify and quantify them. But the interesting part, of course, is the intersections and the quality education experience, where we're being forced to go now as the technologies are capable of supporting all three of these. So I'm going to go through really briefly what these three are and how they've been validated, and then get to where we're moving with them today. The definition of cognitive presence. This was a hard one because it's the most latent, the one, or the one that, how do you really tell what higher order thinking is, or and whose definition? But we defined it as the extent to which the participants in a configuration or a community are able to construct meaning through communication. It's really just basically the scientific method. And we had four categories, and I'll talk a little bit towards the end about the problem of how you analyze, how you find it. And it really depends on what you use as the unit of analysis, what you're going to categorize. And we used the whole message because we thought the person was sort of developing a coherent thought or an idea, and we tried to code it at the message level. So there were sort of four indicators. There was a triggering event. Often the teacher in a formal education class gives an idea or an assignment or a question. Then the students explored it, a lot of divergent brainstorming kind of thinking. Then they would go through an integrative stage where they were planning to pull and converge their ideas together. And then finally there should be a resolution stage where they apply it to some meaningful kind of a problem. And so that was the theory. Then we went around finding ways to see if that actually existed. And then the idea was we could see if it was different in different classes and why it was different in terms of finding these indicators. As we wrote in that original 2002 article, it's really a critical thinking model, or maybe the most important is the cognitive presence. We want to approach a problem strategically, actively seek out sources of knowledge. And of course on the web now, that's becoming even easier and easier, where there's an almost infinite number of sources. But you have to discover the biases of those sources and sift through these large quantities of information. And then you have to be able to formulate and defend your own positions. So this is the kind of results that we got, and they've been validated by a number of researchers. A little bit on trigger, often just the teacher or some problem coming up. A huge amount of exploration. It's always dominated. People, this is my opinion, this is yours. And if you're not careful, your whole class can end right in this exploration. You've got to drive it up with teacher presence to go to integration. And then finally, little old resolution is only a very tiny percentage of the talk. Some people have criticized the model for having such a large degree of other ones, but that's social presence, or maybe it's administrative details. I don't think it's a big problem. The problem, well, here's another person who found, Meyer in 2003, found very similar results, very low rates of resolution, and that was a real concern. And so we asked ourselves, well, why was this happening? And one could say that it was because it was a lousy class. There was no good instructional design. The teacher wasn't doing his job, wasn't forcing it to the ultimate conclusions. We could also say that, and this is a real concern I have with using content analysis as the model, is that maybe the resolution isn't reflected in the discourse of the conversation. It actually comes out when they're writing a paper or they're applying that knowledge in a real context in their job or something like that. And then maybe formal learning, because it's so removed from most people's real life, maybe there's no space for real applications in formal learning. I think that's why we need, problem-based learning, and we need models that drive it to a resolution, and that there is a real problem that we can look for, which is the poor. The other thing is maybe it's just a bad model, and that it's happening, but we're just not able to measure it. Or maybe the media of online asynchronous discussion is just not very powerful to get to that final stage. Or finally, maybe the 15 weeks of the course is over and you just didn't get to it. So it was a sobering outcome from that, to think, cognitive presence, just because the tools are there that it could happen doesn't mean it is happening. And we were a bit disappointed in our own classes when we examined them to see how low that rate was. Okay, moving along to social presence, we gave it a definition. I'm glad to see there's some talks today about social presence and different people's idea. We defined it as the ability of participants to project themselves socially and emotionally as real people. This was before the postmodern era when a real thing had some meaning. Now everyone's talking about your real isn't my real. Maybe we wouldn't have used this language if we were to do this today. But in any case, we reviewed a lot of the literature, especially the first media analysts, Short and Christie, and people who talked about how the attribute of social presence was confined to the media, that media, there were lean media and rich media, and obviously computer conference would have to be a very lean media because it only had text. But now we see kids with SMS falling in love and lust with very lean media, so we sort of thought that there's more to it than just the effect of the media. But the other thing we found is it's by far the most culturally bound of the presences. And when we first were developing, one of the indicators of social presence is humor. And I had two grad students, one from Scotland and one from Canada. And the guy from Scotland could find all sorts of humorous things, and the guy from Canada found nothing that was funny in the course, you know. So, and we were trying to get reliable instruments, so it's really, it had some problems that way. So what were we looking for? 3 categories: cohesive behaviors, evocatives where we're saying, you know, dear class, or the people who ignored that and just went right into their message. Phatics and salutations, things like, you know, good morning, or things that mean nothing but are just a sort of an opening statement. Interactive behaviors, you know, quoting from other people, asking questions, spurring on interaction. Or affective ones, and here we have use of emoticons, smiley faces, all that sort of thing, humor and self-disclosure. And this one we coded as many times as we found them, sort of used a unit a unit of meaning, as they say, which caused reliability problems. But this just 2 courses compared, and you can see the blue class, they had a lot more sense of social presence on almost all the indicators. Except the compliment one. I don't know, maybe they were excessively polite or something like that, but they were telling each other how wonderful they were, and that was about the only social presence that they outperformed the other class. And then we did some survey work asking students themselves to assess what value this work or various ones of these indicators had on increasing their sense of social presence. And it turned out that addressing other people by name was very important, complimenting, expressing appreciation, replying, expressing emotions, using humor and salutations were the ones that were most significant. And then we found that cognitive presence is sustained and really necessary to have social presence, and that gave us validation for having boot camps or time for people to actually meet each other, to having real-time interaction by adding pictures of people like some of the newer systems have. And then now we're getting into things like Second Life, where we have avatars and things that really allow a lot more deeper sense of social presence to arise. And it's also interesting, people have used the model. This was some work just done in 2005 where they compared online versus face-to-face, and they had the 3 categories of social presence. And this one was interesting because you can see here that the teacher's social presence in the asynchronous learning environment was really very low, whereas over in the face-to-face, they were on the stage, they were in command, their teaching immediacy was really important, and they knew how to work a crowd, whereas in the face-to-face or online environment, there was much more limited. But notice how the students compensated. The students their social presence came up to match the void here that was left by the teacher being less participative. And as you can see, the student participation or their sense of social presence was much less in the face-to-face environment. Okay, just to end the big 3, teaching presence. We talked about the design, facilitation, and direction of cognitive and social presence for the purpose of realizing educational outcomes. And we took the kind of the familiar stuff from distance education research, some of the big names that you may or may not be aware of. People had talked about what a good teacher is in a distance education environment, but they really had no way to measure it. And again, that's what we were after. So the transcript analysis allows researchers we could disaggregate what the instructor was doing because we had all the transcript there. And we found that there were really three major functions as an instructional designer, as facilitating discourse, and as being an expert in their discipline. And we also really started to see that how important teacher presence was, that that's what makes courses break down, is the teacher not being there mostly, or the teacher dominating to a greater degree. So it validated the importance of the teacher in this model. I'll just briefly go through how did we indicate, how did we tag things. As soon as we saw them, establishing time parameters, setting curriculum, we would give them a check mark for in this category of instructional design. Same with facilitating discussion. Not going to dwell on these; they're all published. And providing direct instruction. This was some of the models, Julie Salmon's model on how to e-moderate. It was just a big discussion whether you have to have subject matter expertise. And I guess from where we were coming from, all of our teachers did have subject matter expertise, and they were adding that to the conversation. So you can see different levels. Here's just two examples of an education course and a health course where the teacher presence was higher in all three categories. One could say this person was doing a better job, and it was validated by a number of people. And people were more efficient in each message. Some people were adding direct instruction as well as facilitating discourse, and they were sort of getting 3 for 1, or doing much more efficient in their production and in their contributions. Because one of the problems with computer conferencing is it's very time-consuming for teachers to read and then to write. So we were trying to think if we could give guidance for teachers to kill more than one bird with each stone. That would be a contribution. And there was some nice research done in New York by Peter Shea. Talked about asking students what their impression, their satisfaction with the course, and then correlating it with the 3 indicators of instructional design. And we found that both the perceptions of satisfaction and perceptions of learning, they weren't outrageously high, but they were significant, and sort of validated the model that way. Oh, and then Liam Rourke and I, of course, I taught, I facilitated the first half, and then I made the students facilitate the last half, and we analyzed the transcripts. And I was quite humbled because I found that the teacher presence was way higher in the teacher one than when I was doing it, And so then I had to think what was the cause of that. But then I thought, well, they only had to do it for 1 week, and I had to do it every week. So that was why I didn't do so well. But anyways, it was nice to have an instrument that could make you humble. And again, here's another example of teacher presence and peer moderating. Here you can see this person is the teacher, but notice that we say teaching presence, not teacher presence, because especially in graduate classes, we find that the students themselves, if they're welcomed and allowed, they will take over some of those functions. And so the teacher here did have the highest amount of teaching presence, but certainly not in aggregate. It was sort of distributed across the class. And anyways, it was all interesting. And again, we found, Heckman and Nabby found that the teacher presence was much higher in the face-to-face than it was in the asynchronous learning, where the student presence was allowed to flourish. Okay, so that wasn't. We didn't shut off the whole world. There was lots of other presences that people have written about. Most interesting maybe is emotional presence, the extent to which learners and teachers transform their behavior to accommodate covert and overt presence of emotion. And emotion is a part of the human. This is the rationale from Marty Cleveland Innes. And there is awareness that emotion are at play. And so she asked me, well, why didn't you guys think about emotional presence? And we had included emotional presence as a component of social presence, but we were 3 men, and how could we find emotion anyways? So. Then other people have talked about student presence, and I'm not sure it's much different than social presence, but in any case, other people have talked about the sense of students feeling themselves as contributors or participants as social presence, the student presence. And this was maybe the most interesting model or criticism by Stephen Downes, who's a big guru in the blogging and Web 2.0 world. And he's always on lifelong learning and thinks that, formal learning is such a small part of what learning is all about. And so he says, you should not talk about your presence, but talk about your network. And that's what counts, is your ability to connect with other people and to gather resources from them. And then in the middle, it should be yourself and not just a course, he says. So I thought that was an interesting contribution. There's been a little bit of work, the tediousness of trying to analyze computer transcripts. Our goal was that you could push a button and it would all come back with the answers. And Tom McGlynn, an American, did some work using the cognitive presence, which again is maybe the most challenging one, and used the keywords from the general inquiry categories. And he could press a button and he got reliable or answers, coding results on cognitive presence that were equal to what was attained by human coders. So that was a little light at the end of the tunnel, that maybe there is a possibility. I think and I'm looking for computer scientists among us to look at things like latent semantic analysis and neural nets, so that maybe we can get beyond this tedious hand coding at some point or another. It's also been validated through factor analysis. People found that these things can fall into the codes that we had originally identified. And it's been used as a model for developing simulations. And then I recently used the community of inquiry model to look at the differences between blogs and threaded discussions. And we're currently working to develop indicators for an immersive environment like Second Life. It's also had some nice informal blog support. I found this on a blogger who wrote, and I was quite flattered to read this one, that I think I'm actually applying their framework by default. One of the good things about good models is that you don't really need to apply them. You just find yourself doing it. And he found that he was using the model even in an informal way, so I was quite thrilled to have that. Okay, a little bit. We concluded this 2002 article by saying, our method is wonderful and we can identify and facilitate all these things. Then we started to think about it as we got deeper into it. And the questions of reliability and validity really started to bother me anyways. The first big problem is, what is the unit of analysis? And what do you actually look at when you're coding? Should you look at a sentence, a paragraph, a phrase? And there's problems with all of these. People don't even write the same way. Sometimes what some people call one paragraph, another person would call 4 paragraphs. So does that mean they have 4 times as much cognitive presence or something like that? So you have to make arbitrary decisions. And the most attractive one is to say, well, whenever I see it, I'll code it. And if there's 4 of them, then that's fine. But then we also wanted reliability, and having it so that 2 people can find 4 instances and not 6 instances and 2 instances and calculate reliability results was really challenging. So, as I say, the thematic unit, the whole message. The message is great because you know where it starts, you know where it stops. But sometimes people write on and on and on, and there'll be 5 instances within that. And you'd think a paragraph would be easy, but even Wikipedia, they have 600 words just to describe what a paragraph is. So, and then software, you of course have to use good software to take some of the load off. We used Atlas TI, but I would highly recommend, if anybody's getting into it, is to use a qualitative software package. It really helps. And then when you're calculating reliability, to use something like SPSS. And again, I think it's really important that if you're going to go a quantitative route, that you do calculate the reliability. You have to use multiple coders. Then the ethics problem. You know, what happens typically is that at our university they say you have to get informed consent from every person. So you ask everyone, and 90% of them say, sure, I don't have any problem. But there's 10%, they don't say no, they just don't answer. You know, so then what do you do with them? You can say, well, I'll strip their remarks out, but then in the middle of a thread and you start pulling messages out and you lose the whole thing. So it's a real problem. And sometimes we've so-called redacted them, where we've taken all the personal identification out of them. But then sometimes you lose the threads, and it gets very messy to do as well. And as I mentioned earlier with the example of the jokes, it gets real hard to get reliable. But you can do it if you train coders. And I think it's possible to solve the reliability problem. The worst problem, though, is the validity problem, is that just because you don't see it in the transcript, does that mean it doesn't exist? Or maybe there's that value is coming out in a discussion with their spouse, or with a discussion with other students. That's where the social presence is actually happening, or any of the other three presences. So then I started to think, well, maybe it's better to do qualitative analysis, to just read them, try to extract the meaning for yourself, instead of trying to put them all into little boxes and codes. And I guess the people do both methods. I think if you're rigorous on either one or the other, you can get some answers. But I guess the warning is to take it very seriously how you analyze these transcripts if you're going to go down that road. Okay, I know that we started a little bit late, and I'm already probably over time, but finishing off, we're trying to say, well, the environment has changed since when the world was all about, at least the distance education world was all about computer conferencing. Now we have different tools, and so I'm asking myself whether you can use the same tool to look at different kinds of media. Different media serve different purposes, we know that, and so this is a challenge, is to look at especially the educational semantic web as it arises, and see if the community of inquiry model can be used in the future. And one of the things that I sort of tongue-in-cheek wrote a few years ago was just talking about how if you have a lot of student-student interaction, maybe you don't need so much student-teacher interaction, or you don't need one or the other. And it gets threatening to teachers as they think about removing and pulling back. But one can think about using this community of inquiry model and applying it to where you have just student content kind of interaction, or student-student with or without the teacher. So it gets into the Web 2.0 era, has a lot of synchronous activity. We were based on asynchronous activity. So how does it work when you start coding in real-time interactions, whether they be mediated through a web conference or a virtual environment? And then does adding pictures, the video conferencing, or virtual environment immersion, how does that affect social presence? So I think there's lots we can learn about that. And then, of course, the pragmatic thing is every time you add real-time stuff, then you bind people in time. They have to be there at 8 o'clock kind of thing. And is it worth it for the development of any of these three presences? And finally, the most recent buzz is about immersive environments, where we use avatars, and people walk around and they look the way they wish they looked rather than the way they really look. And does it increase social presence? Well, it is cohesive in the fact that there are so many millions of people who are using it, but they're cohesive from a whole new lingo, a whole new way of talking, new patterns of interactions. It is interactive, but it's got multiple formats. And also, these environments, they're not controlled by the institution. And so people start to talk about personal learning environments that extend beyond what happens in a regular school, like with a blog or a wiki or something like that. And then the real time and the affective, people falling in love and lust and everything else using these tools. In terms of cognitive presence, the triggering potential is that one can be triggered by, I'm sure you all see it in your own email, how you're triggered to look here and look there and go here, and there's such a vast increase in the exposure to different things that are put out, and the real-time data, video cams, podcast. Exploration tools are so much more sophisticated, things like Google Earth, and searching in databases, and it's not just within what the teacher prescribes, but you can go much beyond the teacher's what the teacher's knowledge is very easily on the open net. And you start bumping into multiple cultures, multiple contexts. And then when you try to integrate those two or those three, there's powerful new tools for mapping, cognitive mapping, presence and diagram tools that are coming along now that we certainly didn't have access to 10 years ago. And finally, the resolution, as this learning environment moves from the learning center or the classroom into the home and office, does that increase the resolution, which we're hoping will happen. And finally, teaching presence. Well, a teacher can have a lot more power in terms of their voice. They can use their body language. They can use the tools that they've honed in a face-to-face environment a lot easier. They have more resources for referring students, scaffolding, adaptive tutorials, agents, communities of practice so that teachers can actually be learners continuously through their life. In instructional design, they have way more learning objects, learning design languages, patterns, all that sort of stuff. And finally, in facilitating discourse, you can have agents who will track when things are happening or when this student or when that article is happening, that sort of stuff, decision-making tools. So there's a whole new world opening up there, which I think will affect all three of these presences. And one of the interests, it just recently wrote an article comparing weblogs, and what I found was the biggest difference was in teaching presences, it's really hard to track blogs when students are all doing their own blogs. When they're in your own threaded discussion, you control it, it's there for you, you can see who's logged on, you can get the nice threads happening. When you tell students, well, use your own blogs and amalgamate them, you can sort of do it, but it's hard for a teacher to get a sense of the control that they're used to in a threaded discussion. But I think we have to go there. We have to get out of thinking of learning as just being about what happens in my classroom. And I like this quote from Richard Sampson. He says that learners today, they're used to working for somebody else. They're used to doing, is it on the test? Do I have to do it? How much is it worth? And that isn't good behavior for training people to be lifelong learners. If that's the only thing they learn how to do in school is to follow directions from a teacher. So I think we increasingly have to get students to be able to identify problems of their own and solve them without just having us as the controllers of their learning. So the COI model grew from a traditional institutional focused education. Does it really speak to lifelong learning? What I think it does, and I think that we will have to change what we think about teaching presence when students have an infinite number of teachers that they can access. So to conclude, I think that theoretical models like the community of inquiry can be useful. They give us a way to talk about things. They make it so that people like me get invitations to come to Israel. They have reflective power so that you can help you to think about what's happening in your own classes. Inferential power so that you can, make inferences about if I do something here, how is it going to change there? And of course, it helps us to apply, to make new design interventions. And the advice for practice from the community of inquiry model, Randy Garrison just published a paper a few months ago. He basically is a how-to, how to run an asynchronous threaded discussion based on the community of inquiry model. You might want to look it up in the Journal of Asynchronous Learning. And I love this picture, a real picture of an iceberg. But this is my sense of when you think that you're studying learning by looking at threaded discussions, there's a lot that's happening underneath, and you've got to keep that in mind all the time. So the way you do that is to triangulate those quantitative transcript analysis with other forms of inquiry. But I do believe that the community of inquiry model can and must grow to meet this new emerging 2.0 model. And probably maybe the most famous Canadian, Marshall McLuhan, who coined the word, the media is the message. I think the media does change the message. So I hope, and I don't know how much time there is, but I would welcome any comments or questions or for those who are still awake. Thank you.